the first time a child held my hand, I forgot what kind of man I was supposed to be. The rain had already washed the city clean by the time I stepped out of the car, the pavement reflecting streetlights like broken gold, my shoes silent against the wet concrete as men in dark suits moved around me with quiet precision, waiting for orders I hadn't given yet, because for once, I wasn't thinking about territory or power or the endless calculations that came with both. I was thinking about a small voice that had asked me a question no one ever dared to ask, and it had started so. Simply, it almost felt like nothing. Just another passing moment in a city that never slowed down. I had been standing outside a corner cafe on 8th Avenue, checking my watch, waiting for a meeting I didn't care about, when she approached me, her coat too thin for the weather, her hair pulled back in a way that suggested she hadn't had time to think about herself in a long while. Her eyes sharp though, alert, like someone who had learned the hard way how to keep going. And before I could step away or signal my driver, she spoke, her voice steady but carrying something fragile underneath. "Could you accompany my daughter today?" I remember blinking, not because I didn't hear her, but because no one spoke to me like that. Not without fear, not without hesitation, but she didn't know who I was. And maybe that was the only reason she dared. I followed her gaze down to the little girl beside her, maybe 6 years old, clutching a worn backpack that looked too heavy for her small frame, her eyes wide, curious, completely unafraid as they met mine. And that was the first thing that felt wrong. People didn't look at me like that, not unless they didn't understand what I was capable of, or maybe what I had become. "I just need a few hours," the woman continued, her fingers tightening slightly around the strap of her bag. "I have an interview across town, and her school doesn't open for another hour. I wouldn't ask if I had another option." And there it was, that quiet desperation wrapped in dignity, not begging, not pleading, just stating a fact, and something about that unsettled me more than any threat ever had, because I was used to control, to people needing something from me that I could quantify, money, protection, influence. But this was different. This was trust, misplaced or not. It was still trust, and I should have said no. I should have walked away, let one of my men handle it, let the city continue spinning the way it always did. But instead, I heard myself say, "All right," before my mind had a chance to catch up, and the moment the word left my mouth, everything shifted. My driver stiffened. One of my men stepped forward like he was about to object, but I raised a hand slightly, stopping him without looking, because for reasons I didn't understand yet, I needed this to happen. The woman exhaled, not in relief exactly, but in something quieter, something heavier. "Thank you," she said, her eyes meeting mine for just a second longer, like she was trying to memorize my face, or maybe warn herself not to trust it too much. Then she turned to her daughter, kneeling slightly, adjusting the strap of her backpack with careful hands. "Be good, Lily, okay?" And the girl nodded, her attention already drifting back to me, studying me like I was something new, something interesting, not something dangerous. And when her small hand slipped into mine without hesitation, it felt wrong in a way I couldn't explain, not because it was unfamiliar, but because it was too simple, too easy, like she had just rewritten a rule I had lived by for years without even knowing it existed. And as I stood there in the middle of a city that bent to my will, holding the hand of a child who didn't fear me, I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to consider in a long time. Maybe the most dangerous thing in my world wasn't power. Maybe it was the one thing I had never learned how to control, and it was standing right in front of me, looking up with quiet curiosity, as if I was just another man on the street, and not the one everyone else crossed it to avoid. Her hand was smaller than I expected, warm despite the cold air, her fingers wrapping around mine like it was the most natural thing in the world. And for a moment, I stood there longer than I should have, aware of the way my men had gone completely still behind me, unsure whether to intervene or pretend this was normal, because nothing about this was normal, not for me, not for the life I had built. "Where are we going?" Lily asked, her voice light, curious, like she had not just been handed off to a stranger in a city that taught people not to trust anyone. And I looked down at her, realizing I did not have an answer that made sense outside of my world. "To your school," I said finally, my voice quieter than usual, as if speaking too loudly might break something fragile I did not yet understand. She nodded like that was enough, like I was enough. And that unsettled me more than anything else that morning. The Car door opened before I reached it, my driver already stepping aside, his eyes flicking briefly to the child at my side before returning to me. Waiting for instruction, always waiting, but I hesitated, just for a second, because putting her into that car felt like pulling her into something she did not belong to, something I could not explain. "Can we walk?" she asked suddenly, her gaze drifting toward the street lined with small shops and early morning traffic, and I felt something shift. Again, something I could not name, because no one had ever asked me that before, not when I had the means to make everything faster, easier, controlled, and yet, without fully understanding why, I nodded, signaling my driver to stay back, the faint confusion in his expression almost amusing if I had been in any other state of mind. We started down the sidewalk, her steps uneven but determined, the city moving around us in its usual rhythm, people rushing, horns echoing in the distance, the smell of coffee drifting from a nearby cafe, and for the first time in a long time, I was not ahead of it, not controlling it, just walking through it like everyone else. "You look sad," Lily said after a few minutes, her voice cutting through the noise with quiet precision, and I stopped without realizing it, her words landing somewhere deeper than they should have. I looked down at her, searching for something in her expression, some sign that she understood what she was saying, but there was none, just simple observation. Honest and unfiltered. "Do I?" I asked, more to myself than to her. She nodded, completely certain. "My mom looks like that when she is worried," she added, swinging our joined hands slightly, as if this conversation carried no weight at all, and I found myself exhaling slowly, a breath I had not noticed I was holding, because no one in my world ever asked how I felt. They only reacted to what I did. And here was a child, 6 years old, seeing something I had spent years hiding. "You do not have to be sad today," she continued, her voice softer now, like she was offering something instead of pointing it out, and I almost laughed at that. Not because it was funny, but because it was impossible, except for the fact that in that moment, walking beside her, I felt something unfamiliar, something lighter, like the weight I carried had shifted just enough to remind me it could move at all. We reached the corner where her school building came into view, still closed, the metal gate halfway down, a few parents waiting nearby with their children, and I watched as Lily's attention shifted completely, her grip loosening slightly as she spotted another girl her age across the street, waving excitedly like nothing else in the world mattered. And that was when it hit me. She had already forgotten what I was, or maybe she had never seen it in the first place, and as she let go of my hand to run a few steps ahead before stopping to look back at me, making sure I was still there, I realized something I had not allowed myself to believe in years. For the first time in a long time, someone expected me to stay, not because they feared what would happen if I left, but because they trusted that I would not. The gate was still halfway down when she looked back at me again, like she needed to make sure I had not disappeared in the few seconds she had turned away, and I stayed where I was, hands in my coat pockets, watching a world I had never really paid attention to before unfold in front of me. Parents crouching to fix backpacks, kids trading stories about things that felt small and somehow important at the same time, and for a moment, I felt like an outsider in a place that ran on rules I had never learned. "You are still here," Lily said, walking back toward me with that same calm certainty, like my presence was not something to question, just something that was. And I gave a small nod, unsure why that mattered as much as it seemed to. "I said I would be," I replied, my voice steady, but quieter than the one I used in every other part of my life. And she smiled, not impressed, not surprised, just accepting it as truth, like promises were supposed to be kept without hesitation. And that simple expectation settled somewhere deeper than I wanted to admit. The metal gate rattled as it began to lift, the sound sharp against the morning air, and the crowd shifted forward in a slow wave, parents guiding their children toward the entrance, letting go one by one. And I felt something unfamiliar tighten in my chest as Lily adjusted her backpack, her fingers fumbling slightly with the zipper before she looked up at me again. "Will you come back later?" she asked, her tone casual, like she was asking about the weather, but the question landed heavier than anything else she had said, because I did not know how to answer it. I did not do later. I did not make plans that depended on anything other than necessity. And yet, standing there, I found myself considering something I had not in years. What it would mean to return for someone who expected me to. "I have work," I said instead. defaulting to the only answer that had ever made sense in my world. But she did not seem discouraged. She just tilted her head slightly, studying me the same way she had been since the moment we met. My mom works too, she said simply, but she still comes back. And there it was again, that quiet way of saying something that sounded small, but carried weight I could not ignore. I exhaled slowly, glancing toward the street where my car was parked out of sight, where my men were no doubt watching, waiting, trying to understand what I was doing standing outside a school like any other man. And for the first time, I did not care if they understood. "What time do you finish?" I asked, the question leaving my mouth before I had fully decided to ask it. Her face lit up just slightly, like she had been expecting that answer all along. 3:30, she said quickly, holding up 3 fingers and then adding one more halfway. Like that made it clearer, and I nodded, committing it to memory in a way I rarely did for anything outside of business. "Then I will be here," I said. And the moment the words settled between us, something shifted again. Something quieter this time, but stronger, like a line had been crossed. Without warning, she stepped closer then, reaching out and hugging me without hesitation, her arms barely wrapping around my side. And I froze for half a second, my body not used to that kind of contact. Not without reason, not without calculation. But then I felt it. The absence of fear, the absence of expectation. Just warmth, simple and unguarded, and my hand moved almost on its own, resting lightly on her shoulder. Not holding, not controlling, just there. "Okay," she said softly before pulling back, already turning toward the entrance as if the moment had been enough, as if she trusted it to last, and I watched her walk through those doors without looking back again, like she had already decided I would be there when she returned. And as the gate lowered behind her, separating her world from mine once more, I stood there longer than I should have, staring at the empty space where she had been, realizing that somewhere between the rain, the walk, and a simple question I had not been prepared to answer, I had agreed to something far more dangerous than any deal I had ever made. I had agreed to show up. I did not go to the meeting that morning, and that alone was enough to unsettle everyone around me, because I never missed meetings, not the kind that decided who stayed and who disappeared from conversations that shaped the city. But as I stood there outside that school with the echo of a small voice still lingering in my head, none of it felt as urgent as it should have. My phone buzzed twice in my pocket before I finally pulled it out. A message from Victor asking if I was on my way, followed by another that simply read, "We are waiting," and I stared at the screen longer than necessary before locking it again without responding. The silence from me would say enough. It always did. I turned back toward the street where my car idled a block away, and as I approached, the door opened immediately, my driver stepping aside while one of my men, Daniel, leaned slightly forward from the passenger seat, his expression carefully neutral, but I could see the question in his eyes, the one he would never ask directly. "Not without permission. Plans have changed," I said simply. As I slid into the back seat, the leather cool against my coat, the familiar environment closing in around me like a world I had stepped out of and now had to re-enter. "Where to?" the driver asked, glancing at me through the rearview mirror. And for a second, I almost said the office, almost returned everything to its usual order, but instead, I gave an address that did not belong to my usual routine. "Queens," I said, watching the slight shift in Daniel's posture at the unexpected answer. The car pulled into traffic smoothly, merging into the flow of the city, and I leaned back, my gaze drifting to the window as buildings passed in a blur of glass and concrete. But my thoughts stayed fixed on something far smaller, a child who had looked at me like I was just a man, and a woman who had trusted me without knowing what I was capable of. It did not make sense, not in the structure of the life I had built. Trust was a currency, controlled, measured, never given freely, and yet she had handed it to me like it was nothing, like it cost her nothing at all. "You want us to run a background?" Daniel asked carefully after a few minutes, his tone low, professional, as if he were discussing any other situation. But I knew what he meant. He meant the woman, the child, the situation that did not fit into any of our usual categories. I did not answer immediately, because part of me wanted to say no, to leave it untouched, to let it remain something simple for once. But simplicity did not exist in my world without consequence, and I could not afford to ignore that. "Just basic," I said. Finally, My voice even. Name, work, anything that stands out. Daniel nodded once, already pulling out his phone. Efficient as always, and I turned my attention back to the window, the city stretching out around us in endless layers of movement and noise. But for the first time in years, it felt distant, like I was observing it instead of controlling it. We reached the address in under 30 minutes, a modest apartment building tucked between two older structures, the kind of place people passed without noticing. The kind of place that held lives built on routine and effort rather than influence. I stepped out of the car, the air colder here, quieter, and for a moment, I just stood there, taking it in, the worn steps, the flickering light above the entrance, the faint sound of a television from somewhere inside. And I realized something that unsettled me more than any threat ever had. This was her world. This was where she returned every night, where she raised her daughter, where she kept going despite whatever weight she carried. And I had walked into it without understanding what it meant. My phone buzzed again. A new message from Victor, shorter this time, almost impatient, and I ignored it, sliding the phone back into my pocket as I looked up at the building. Because for the first time in a long time, there was something else I needed to understand, not a rival, not a deal, but a woman who had looked me in the eye and asked for help like I was capable of giving it. And somehow, without realizing it, I had already decided that I was. I did not knock right away, which was unusual for me because hesitation was not something I allowed, not in decisions, not in actions, but standing in front of that worn apartment door with chipped paint and a faint number barely holding on above the frame. I found myself pausing, listening instead to the quiet hum of life behind it, the muffled sound of a television, the soft movement of someone walking across old wooden floors. And it felt different from any place I had ever entered, because there was no strategy here, no negotiation, no power to assert, just a space that existed without knowing I was about to step into it. My phone buzzed again in my pocket, but I ignored it, letting the silence stretch for one more second before I finally raised my hand and knocked, the sound sharper than I expected in the narrow hallway. And almost immediately I heard footsteps approach from inside, quick but cautious, the door opening just a few inches at first, a chain still in place, and Emily's face appeared in the gap, her eyes widening slightly when she saw me, not fear exactly, but surprise, like she had not expected me to follow beyond the boundaries of that morning. "You found us," she said quietly, her voice carrying a mix of confusion and something else she had not decided how to name yet, and I gave a small nod, aware of how this must look. A man she barely knew standing at her door in the middle of the day. "I was nearby," I said, which was not entirely true but close enough to pass without explanation. Her gaze held mine for a moment longer, searching, measuring, deciding whether to open that door or close it, and I waited without pushing, without stepping forward, because for once, control did not belong to me. After a second, she reached up and slid the chain free, opening the door just enough to let me in. And as I stepped across the threshold, I felt it again, that shift, like I had crossed into something that operated on rules I did not understand. The apartment was small, but clean, the kind of clean that came from effort rather than ease. A couch with a folded blanket on one end, a small table cluttered with papers, and a half-empty coffee mug. A child's drawing taped unevenly to the wall, bright colors standing out against everything else. And I took it all in without meaning to, cataloging details the way I always did. But this time they did not feel like information. They felt like pieces of a life I had no place in. "I thought you would be busy," Emily said, closing the door behind me, her arms crossing lightly as if she needed something to hold on to. Not defensive, but not entirely relaxed either. And I turned to face her, aware of the distance between us, the difference in our worlds that neither of us had addressed out loud yet. I replied, my voice even. But I wanted to make sure everything was all right. The words sounded unfamiliar even as I said them, like they belonged to someone else. Someone who checked in instead of moving on, and she noticed. I could see it in the way her expression shifted slightly, the tension easing just enough to let something softer through. "We are fine," she said after a moment, glancing toward the table where a stack of papers sat neatly arranged. "I got the interview," she added, almost as an afterthought, like she was not sure why she was telling me, and I nodded once. Something settling quietly in my chest at that information, because it mattered in a way I could not explain. "That is good," I said, and for a second, neither of us spoke. The silence not uncomfortable, just unfamiliar, like we were both trying to understand what this interaction was supposed to be. Then her eyes shifted back to me, more focused now, more certain. "You did not have to do this," she said, her voice steady, not accusing, just stating a fact, and I held her gaze, knowing she was right, knowing this was not something I did for anyone. "I know," I answered simply, because there was no explanation that would make sense, not to her, not even to me. And as the quiet settled again between us, I realized something I had not expected when I knocked on that door. This was not about obligation, not about control. It was about a choice I had already made without fully understanding it. And standing there in a place where nothing belonged to me, I was beginning to understand why. Emily moved first, stepping past me toward the small kitchen area like she needed something to do with her hands, pouring what looked like fresh coffee into a chipped mug before pausing, glancing back at me with a hesitation that felt new compared to the quiet certainty she had shown earlier. "Do you want some?" she asked, the question simple, almost ordinary, and yet it carried a weight I was not used to. Because offers in my world always came with expectations, with calculations, but this did not. This was just coffee in a small apartment on a weekday morning. And for a moment I did not answer, not because I did not want it, but because I was not sure how to exist in a moment that required nothing from me in return. "Yes," I said finally, my voice lower than usual. And she nodded once, turning back to the counter, the soft clink of ceramic against the surface filling the silence between us. I stepped further into the room, my gaze drifting again to the details I had noticed before, the stack of unpaid bills partially hidden under a notebook, the careful way everything had been arranged to make the space feel bigger than it was, the small pair of shoes by the door that did not quite line up, like Lily had kicked them off in a hurry that morning, and something about that made the place feel lived in, real in a way that none of my properties ever had. "She liked you," Emily said after a moment, her back still turned as she handed me the mug, her fingers brushing mine briefly before pulling away, not lingering, not intentional, just a passing contact that felt more grounding than anything else I had experienced that day. I took the coffee, the warmth spreading through my hands, and nodded slightly. "She is not afraid," I replied, stating the obvious, but meaning something else entirely. Emily let out a soft breath that almost sounded like a quiet laugh. "She does not know how to be," she said, turning to face me now, leaning lightly against the counter as if she had decided, at least for this moment, not to keep her distance. "I try to keep it that way," she added, her eyes holding mine. And there it was again, that strength, not loud, not forceful, but steady, like something that refused to break even when it had every reason to. I took a sip of the coffee, letting the silence settle for a second before speaking again. "That is not easy," I said, because it was not in a city like this, not in a life like hers. And she shook her head slightly, her expression softening but not losing its edge. "No, it is not," she agreed, glancing briefly toward the window as if measuring something only she could see. "But she deserves that much," and I watched her as she said it. The way her voice did not waver, the way her posture remained steady even as the words carried more weight than she let on. And I realized something I had missed before. She was not just surviving. She was protecting, in her own way, in a way that did not rely on force or fear, but on persistence, on showing up every day no matter how hard it got. And that kind of strength was something I understood, even if it looked different from my own. "You trust easily," I said after a moment, not as a question, but as an observation, and her gaze sharpened slightly, the softness pulling back just enough to reveal something more guarded underneath. "No," she replied quietly. "I choose carefully," and the distinction settled between us like a line drawn without needing to be explained, because she had chosen to trust me, not by accident, not out of desperation, but by decision, and that realization carried more weight than anything else that had happened so far. I set the mug down on the table, the quiet sound grounding me in a moment that felt strangely unfamiliar. "I will be there at 3:30, I said, not because she had asked again, but because it mattered that I said it, that I made it real, and she studied me for a second, searching for something she needed to believe, before giving a small nod. Okay, she said simply, accepting it without question, and for the first time in a long time, I understood what it meant to give someone your word and have it matter in a way that had nothing to do with power, nothing to do with fear, just presence. And as I stood there in a place that had nothing to do with the world I controlled, I realized that showing up at 3:30 was no longer just a plan, it was a promise. I left before the coffee had time to cool, not because I needed to, but because staying any longer felt like stepping too far into something I did not fully understand yet. And control had always meant knowing where the line was, even if I had just crossed it without meaning to. The hallway outside her apartment felt colder than before, the quiet heavier, like the world I belonged to was waiting just beyond the door, ready to pull me back into its rhythm. My phone buzzed the second I stepped outside, and this time I answered. "Talk," I said, my voice returning to something sharper, more familiar. Victor did not waste time. He never did. "You missed the meeting," he said, not accusing, just stating a fact that carried its own weight. "Reschedule," I replied, already moving down the steps, the city noise growing louder with each step, grounding me back into the structure I knew. "That is not how this works," he said, and I could picture the slight tension in his jaw even without seeing him. "Today it is," I answered, ending the call before he could respond, because for once, I was not interested in explaining a decision I did not fully understand myself. The car door opened as I approached, Daniel already watching me with the same quiet attention he always had. "Everything all right?" he asked as I slid into the back seat, and I paused for a fraction of a second before nodding. "Yes," I said, even though the word felt incomplete, like it did not fully capture whatever had shifted inside me that morning. The car pulled away from the curb, merging back into traffic, and I leaned back, closing my eyes briefly, letting the movement settle something restless in my chest. But it did not last, because Daniel spoke again, his tone more careful this time. "We ran what you asked," he said, holding out his phone with a few notes already pulled up, and I took it, my gaze scanning the screen quickly. "Emily Carter, 28, part-time administrative work, recently applied for a full-time position, no criminal record, no outstanding issues, just a life that looked exactly like what it was, ordinary, except for the fact that it was not easy, not from what I could see. Rent overdue twice in the past year, multiple job changes, everything pointing to someone who had been pushed more than once and still chose to keep going." I handed the phone back without comment, staring out the window again as the city blurred past. "Anything else?" I asked, my voice neutral, and Daniel hesitated for just a second before answering. "There was something small," he said. "A notice filed last month. Building maintenance issue. Repeated complaints. Nothing serious. Just unresolved." I nodded once, not because it mattered in the way he thought it might, but because it told me something else, something about the kind of life she was managing, the kind that required constant attention to things that should have been simple but never were. "Take care of it," I said, the decision coming easily, almost automatically, and Daniel glanced at me briefly, just enough to register the shift, discreetly. I added, before he could ask, because this was not about control, not about ownership. It was about removing something unnecessary from a life that already carried enough. The car continued through the city, the familiar skyline rising around us, but it felt different now, like something had shifted in the way I saw it, not as something I ruled, but as something that existed beyond me, full of lives that moved without ever intersecting with mine. Except today, except because of one question that should not have mattered, and yet it did, more than anything else I had dealt with in weeks. I checked the time, just after noon, hours still left before 3:30, and for the first time in a long time, I was aware of time passing in a way that had nothing to do with deadlines or deals, but with a promise I had made to a child who believed I would keep it. And as I sat there, watching the city move around me, I realized something that should have been obvious. This was not about helping anymore. It was about becoming someone who did not walk away. And that was a far more dangerous change than anything my world had ever demanded of me. I arrived 10 minutes early, which was not something I ever did, not for anything that did not involve control or calculation, but standing across the street from the school with the engine off and the city noise humming around me. I found myself watching the clock instead of commanding it. The building looked the same as it had that morning, quiet, ordinary. The kind of place no one noticed unless they had a reason to be there. And now I did. My phone remained silent for once, either because Victor had decided to wait or because he had realized I would not answer. And for the first time, I did not feel the need to check. I stepped out of the car before the driver could open the door, the air cooler than it had been earlier, carrying the faint sound of children's voices from inside. As the day came to an end, parents had already begun to gather near the gate, some scrolling through their phones, others talking quietly, all of them positioned in that familiar space between waiting and relief. And I stood among them, not apart, not above, just there, unnoticed for once. And that in itself felt like something new. The metal gate lifted slowly with a mechanical hum, and the doors opened, releasing a wave of small footsteps and laughter that filled the sidewalk with movement. Children rushing forward, backpacks bouncing, voices overlapping in a way that made everything else fade for a moment, and I scanned the crowd. Without thinking, my eyes moving with the same precision I used in every other situation. Except this time I was not looking for a threat. I was looking for one person, and when I saw her, weaving through the other kids with that same determined energy, her eyes searching until they landed on me, something shifted again, subtle but undeniable. She smiled, not wide, not exaggerated, just enough to show that she had expected me to be there, and that expectation had been met. She moved faster then, closing the distance between us without hesitation, and when she reached me, her hand slipped into mine like it had that morning, as if no time had passed at all. "You came back," she said, her voice carrying that same quiet certainty, and I nodded once. The words unnecessary because the action had already answered the question. I said I would. I replied, and she accepted it with a simple nod. Like consistency was something she understood better than most. We stepped aside as the crowd continued to move around us, the noise fading slightly as the moment settled. "My mom said she would be a little late," Lily added, adjusting her backpack with one hand, her other still holding onto mine without any sign of letting go. And I glanced at the time, 3:34, not late by any real measure, but enough for her to notice. "Then we wait," I said, and she seemed satisfied with that, her attention already shifting to something else as she pointed toward a small bench near the entrance. "Can we sit there?" she asked, and I nodded, guiding her toward it, the simple act feeling unfamiliar in a way I could not fully explain. We sat side by side, the space between us small but unguarded, her legs swinging slightly above the ground as she looked out at the street. Watching cars pass like each one carried a story she could almost understand. "Do you always come back?" she asked after a moment, her voice softer now, more thoughtful. And the question caught me off guard in a way few things did, because it was not about today, not really. It was about something larger, something I had never considered from her perspective. I looked ahead, the city stretching out in front of us, full of movement and decisions that rarely accounted for anyone but myself, and I thought about the answer, not the one that would be easiest, but the one that would be true. I did not. I said finally, my voice steady but quieter than before, "But I will now." And as the words settled between us, I felt it again, that shift, stronger this time, like something had been set into motion that could not be undone. She nodded slowly, as if that answer made sense to her in a way it did not yet make sense to me. And then, without another word, she leaned slightly against my arm, her trust unspoken but absolute, and I did not move away, not this time, not when staying felt like the only choice that mattered. Emily arrived at 3:38, her steps quick but controlled, her eyes scanning the small crowd with a focus that told me she had been thinking about this moment long before she turned the corner. And when she saw us sitting on that bench, Lily leaning lightly against my arm like it was the most natural place in the world, something in her expression shifted, not shock, not relief exactly, but something quieter, something that settled instead of reacting. She slowed as she approached, her gaze moving between us, taking in the details without asking for them. "I am sorry I am late," she said, her voice steady but softer than before, and Lily immediately straightened, slipping off the bench and moving toward her. "It is okay," she said quickly. He stayed, and the way she said it made the words carry more weight than they should have, like it was not just about waiting a few extra minutes, but about something larger that she had already decided to believe in. Emily's eyes lifted to mine then, searching for something she could not quite name, and I met her gaze without looking away, Because there was nothing to hide. Not in this moment. Traffic, she added, almost as if she needed to explain it to herself more than to me. And I gave a small nod. We waited, I said simply, and she held my gaze for a second longer before nodding back, the tension in her shoulders easing just enough to let something else take its place, something closer to trust than caution. Thank you, she said, and this time it sounded different from the first time she had said it. Less uncertain, more grounded, like she understood what she was thanking me for. Lily reached for her hand, but before they could turn to leave, she looked back at me, her expression thoughtful. Are you coming tomorrow? She asked, her voice carrying that same quiet certainty that had unsettled me from the beginning. And I felt Emily's attention shift immediately, her eyes moving to me with a question she did not speak out loud. Because this was no longer just a passing moment. This was something that could become routine, something that could mean something if it continued. And I considered the answer, not the easiest one, not the one that would keep everything simple, but the one that had already started to take shape without my permission. If you need me to, I said, my voice calm, leaving the choice where it belonged, and Lily nodded like that was already decided, like need had nothing to do with it. We do, she said, her grip tightening slightly around her mother's hand, and Emily exhaled slowly, the sound almost inaudible but carrying weight. She looked down at her daughter, then back at me, and something in her expression shifted again, not surrender, not dependence, but recognition, like she understood that this was not about taking something from me. It was about allowing something to exist that neither of us had planned for. You do not have to, she said quietly, giving me an out she probably expected me to take, the kind that kept boundaries clear and lives separate. And for a moment, I saw the version of myself who would have accepted that, who would have nodded and stepped back into a world where everything was controlled and predictable. But that version of me had already been interrupted, reshaped by a small hand that did not hesitate, and a question that did not come with fear. I know, I answered, and that was enough, because it meant I was choosing this, not out of obligation, not out of curiosity, but because something in me had already changed. Lily smiled again, satisfied in a way that only children could be when something felt right without needing to explain why, and she tugged lightly at her mother's hand, already ready to move forward. Emily gave me one last look, something unspoken passing between us that did not need to be defined yet, and then they turned, walking down the sidewalk together, their steps steady, their world continuing the way it always had, except now it intersected with mine, and I stood there watching them until they disappeared into the rhythm of the city, realizing that for the first time in a long time, I was not thinking about what I controlled or what I could gain. I was thinking about what I could protect, and somewhere between a simple request and a promise I had not planned to keep, I had become someone who showed up not because he had to, but because someone believed he would, and that belief had changed everything.